Violent offending is much more common among ex-servicemen than their civilian counterparts. A study, the biggest of its kind ever carried out, has been looking at the records of thousands of people who've served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Sky's Richard Suchet reports.
The horrors of war will forever be etched onto the mind of Lewis Mackay. He saw his commander lose both legs in Afghanistan after stepping on an improvised explosive device.
When I come back, I found that I had become very angry and felt very angry towards my wife. In my head, she didn't exist whatsoever. If she did something that I didn't, in my head, thought was right, then I would feel the urge to lash out. And it actually got to the point where I was physically sitting on my hands and biting my hands to stop myself doing that.
Lewis's case is not unusual. Research published today shows that young men are more likely to turn to violence if they've served in the armed forces, particularly in the lower ranks. Of around 3,000 troops under the age of 30, nearly 21% have a conviction for violence. That compares to around 7% in the civilian world. And men who've served in Iraq or Afghanistan are 53% more likely to commit a violent offence than their colleagues in non-combat roles.
Those in the armed forces are less likely to offend than the general population. So that's taken overall. But within that group, unfortunately, there are groups more at risk. And in particular, those who have deployed in combat roles and also have mental health and drinking problems afterwards, there we do see quite a marked increase in violent offending in the years that follow their deployment.
The Ministry of Defence said we're committed to supporting members of our armed forces and their families as they return to civilian life post-deployment. That's why we funded this research and have comprehensive mental health support available before, during and after operations.
I asked for help and I found help. The younger lads who come out refuse to ask for help because it's seen as a weakness. Therefore they bottle it up and then they, creates mistakes.
The report acknowledges that those who choose to become a soldier are likely to have a more aggressive disposition than your average person. But almost 10 years on since the start of the Iraq War, it's clear we still don't fully understand the impact that conflict on this scale has on our servicemen and women. Richard Suchet, Sky News.
Well, joining us from Lee in Greater Manchester is Bob Paxman, Chief Executive of Talking to Minds, a charity which helps veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and other severe stress-related conditions. Good morning to you. Now, you've been in hostile environments yourself and suffered nightmares and flashbacks and were eventually diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. What was it like for you to reintegrate into civilian life?
Well, it was very, very difficult because at the time I was working overseas in Iraq as a security contractor. So to come back to UK and still experience the nightmares and flashbacks and the severe aggression that I was displaying was very, very difficult for me to actually become part of the community again.
And what sort of help did you receive?
Well, initially I went through a series of existing organisations, charities and also the NHS. I had the classic forms of trauma-focused therapy, CBT and EMDR, and they didn't work for me. Very quickly I found out that they didn't work for a lot of other people as well. So on my time back from Iraq, I was actually spending my own resources, my own funds to explore other avenues. And this is how the charity is actually formed, was around an approach that we've designed ourselves that's non-trauma focused.
So tell us about Talking to Minds and that new approach that you're telling us of.
Well, we're actually working with the emotional content when it was of a memory when it was actually first created. So in psychology terms, we're working with the childhood amnesia phase of the autobiographical memory, and we're finding that very quickly by reframing or assisting the client to reframe their perception of an event, a traumatic series of memories, but reframing that very quickly, we're finding that there are long-term gains for the symptomology of post-traumatic stress disorder and other severe stress-related conditions. It all disappears, basically.
But what do you think the reasons are behind ex-service personnel being more likely to be violent offenders when back in civilian life? Why isn't it that they withdraw into their shell as a different type of response?
Well, we've got to look at the training. The guys are taught to engage with the enemy and kill the enemy. That's not a normal, everyday scenario for people living in a civilian environment. So these guys are experiencing some very traumatic, some very horrific and violent things overseas. And when they come back, and you, as the report says, and you add alcohol to that problem, then all of a sudden the emotional, overwhelming feelings are coming to the surface. The highly repressed emotions are actually becoming to the fore, and the guys are stepping over the line there and being very violent and in many cases committing crimes.
They need the help to change that behaviour. Bob Paxman, Chief Executive of Talking to Minds, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.